It's really something how fast global politics can just shift. You think you've got a handle on things, and then bam, something totally unexpected happens.
It really keeps you on your toes.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing here, this deep dive, trying to make sense of these big international moves. Today, we're looking at, well, the changes in U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, and also what's been happening between India and Pakistan.
And we're doing this through the lens of Tenenbaum's analysis, right?
Right. His insights are sort of the backbone for today. Think of this as your shortcut to getting up to speed on these really complicated issues based on what Tenenbaum's been saying.
Yeah, and what's really interesting looking at Tenenbaum's work is how he sees a kind of common thread, a consistent approach across these different regions that seem, totally separate at first glance.
That's a great point. Tenenbaum really hammers this home, that a key part of the U.S. strategy, at least for a period, was this core belief that you can negotiate anything. Like almost any problem can be solved if you just sit down and talk.
A negotiation-first approach.
Yeah. And Tenenbaum argues this really shaped how the U.S. interacted with other countries. Less focus on force, more on dialogue.
And Tenenbaum connects this to other big situations too, doesn't he? Like the early days with Ukraine and Russia, and definitely the India-Pakistan dynamic.
He does. Those are key examples Tenenbaum uses to show this preference for negotiation over, jumping straight to military options.
Right.
But it wasn't just about avoiding war, though obviously that's a factor. Tenenbaum also flags a really strong economic driver here.
The making money aspect.
Exactly. The idea, as Tenenbaum lays it out, was that successful negotiation, making deals, well, that brings economic benefits, way better than the cost and destruction of conflict.
So a very transactional view of foreign policy, according to Tenenbaum.
Very much so. Which, okay, brings us to the Middle East. How did this negotiation focus actually play out there? Because that region is, well, it's complicated.
Super complicated. And Tenenbaum offers some pretty surprising examples, like the whole situation with Syria.
Right. Tenenbaum talks about this willingness to actually engage with the Syrian president, a figure with a history linked to al-Qaeda, no less.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive on the surface.
Totally. But Tenenbaum's point is that the main goal wasn't about liking the regime. It was about trying to create more stability in the region overall.
So the calculation, according to Tenenbaum, was maybe engaging even with someone problematic could serve a bigger strategic purpose, like stabilizing things.
That seems to be Tenenbaum's right on it. A calculated risk, maybe putting geopolitics ahead of, the regime's past actions.
And the strategic prize, in Tenenbaum's view, getting Syria back into the sort of Arab community, and crucially, pulling it away from Iran's orbit.
That was the big play, Tenenbaum suggests, reducing Iranian influence.
But, and this is a big but that Tenenbaum highlights, Syria itself is incredibly fractured internally.
Oh, yeah. So many different factions. You've got the Kurds, other groups. Their interests don't always line up with Damascus.
And Tenenbaum also mentions violence against minorities. Right. Like the Druze.
Yeah.
Things that even got international attention. It's hardly a stable picture.
Not at all. It shows just how messy that environment is.
Which leads to maybe an uncomfortable point Tenenbaum raises. The idea that achieving that broader stability might have meant, well,
sacrificing certain interests, like the Kurds.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Tenenbaum implies there might have been a kind of pragmatic trade-off being considered, prioritizing the big picture, even if it hurts some groups. That's a tough aspect of realpolitik, I suppose.
And Tenenbaum weaves in the Saudi connection too, right? The existing arms deals, the investments.
Yeah, he suggests those weren't separate things. They were part of this broader strategy, according to his analysis. Maybe leverage, maybe just creating interdependence.
Okay, so that's Syria and Saudi Arabia. What about Iran? Because Tenenbaum draws a really interesting contrast there.
He really does. On one hand, you had these attempts, or at least talk of attempts, to negotiate directly with Iran. But then on the other hand, you saw direct military force used against the Houthis in Yemen. And the Houthis are widely seen as, well, linked to Iran. Proxies, basically.
That difference is stark, and Tenenbaum points to why the force was used against the Houthis specifically.
Yeah, it was about the shipping lanes, wasn't it?
Exactly. Tenenbaum says their attacks were hitting global trade, disrupting the Suez Canal, pushing up costs everywhere, a tangible economic impact.
Right, so hit them hard because they're messing with business.
Pretty much Tenenbaum's assessment. But then he also notes, once the Houthis kind of backed off on disrupting shipping,
the focus shifted back towards maybe talking again?
Seems like it. Based on Tenenbaum's analysis, force them back to negotiation.
Which is where things get really tricky with Israel, as Tenenbaum explains.
Ah, yes. Because Israel had major concerns about easing up on Syria, didn't they?
Huge concerns. From their perspective, which Tenenbaum notes is understandable, Syria was still a hotbed for extremist groups. Lifting sanctions could seem like empowering potential attackers.
So you had a real clash of priorities there, as Tenenbaum sees it. The U.S. push for broader stability, potentially engaging Syria.
Right, and Israel's very immediate, very real security worries, those things didn't necessarily line up.
Tenenbaum also throws in an interesting observation about the personal dynamic between the U.S. president at the time and Netanyahu.
Oh, yeah? What's up?
Just that, according to Tenenbaum, the U.S. leader maybe didn't like being upstage, didn't like sharing the spotlight.
Interesting.
And Tenenbaum suggests this might explain why some actions, like on sanctions perhaps, seemed very direct, almost bypassing Israel.
Like taking charge personally.
Maybe. It fits with Tenenbaum's overall picture of this administration seeing conflict, any kind of fighting, as just bad for business, bad for global growth.
The deal-making imperative overriding other concerns.
That seems to be Tenenbaum's core argument there. Okay, let's shift gears slightly, because Tenenbaum also looked closely at India and Pakistan. Another incredibly tense situation.
And potentially even more dangerous given the nuclear element. Tenenbaum mentions the U.S. role in trying to broker a ceasefire there, too.
He does. There were claims of U.S. involvement in getting hostilities to stop, but, as Tenenbaum is quick to point out, those ceasefires, well, they get violated a lot.
Right. It shows the deep mistrust is still there. The underlying problems haven't just vanished.
Definitely not. Though Tenenbaum does suggest one factor holding Pakistan back from major conflict is its economy.
Ah, the economic vulnerability. They just can't afford a big war.
That's Tenenbaum's assessment. The economic fallout would be devastating for them, a major deterrent.
But still, you have two nuclear-armed states right next to each other. Tenenbaum reminds us, even with safety protocol,
the risk of miscalculation is always there. It's terrifying.
And Tenenbaum cites the Rutgers University study, doesn't he? About what even a limited nuclear exchange could do.
Yeah, it's sobering. A small-scale nuclear war, maybe hitting cities, could apparently trigger a global climate disaster. A nuclear winter scenario, basically. Massive temperature drops worldwide.
Just underscores the unbelievable stakes.
Which leads to probably the most alarming part of Tenenbaum's analysis here. The specific intelligence that apparently triggered a major intervention.
Right. This wasn't just theoretical risk anymore. Tenenbaum talks about Marco Rubio getting involved because of specific intelligence.
What was it? What did they think was happening?
According to Tenenbaum's account, there were worrying signs. Indian aircraft movements that looked like they might be preparing a preemptive strike.
Against what?
Against Pakistan's nuclear facilities. That was the fear Tenenbaum describes.
Wow. Okay. The consequences of that. It's just unthinkable.
Absolutely. Because Tenenbaum points out the almost certain Pakistani response to an attack on their nuclear sites would be
using their own nuclear weapons.
Exactly. You're looking at immediate, catastrophic escalation.
And Tenenbaum mentioned something about how this alarm was raised in Indian aircraft.
Yeah. Apparently an Indian plane equipped to detect radioactivity picked up something unusual near Pakistani nuclear sites. That's what Tenenbaum says triggered the red flags.
And unlike, say, Iran, where maybe locations are debated, Tenenbaum stresses that Pakistan's nuclear sites are generally known.
Right, which makes a preemptive strike scenario, however horrific, technically more feasible, perhaps.
Yeah.
But the risk?
The risk is astronomical, as Tenenbaum makes crystal clear. A mistake, a misread signal, anything could lead to a nuclear exchange with global consequences. It's chilling.
So pulling it all together from Tenenbaum's perspective, you see this real push for negotiation-shaping policy.
Yeah, a willingness to talk to Syria, balancing acts with Saudi Arabia and Israel, trying dialogue with Iran.
While still using force against the Houthis when shipping was hit.
Right, and then applying that same negotiation focus, reportedly, to try and cool things down between India and Pakistan.
And Tenenbaum really drives home how interconnected all this is. It's not just isolated incidents.
Not at all. What happens in the Middle East affects Asia, affects global trade. It's all linked. Incredibly complex stuff, as Tenenbaum shows.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty big question to think about. Drawing on Tenenbaum's work, If international relations becomes much more focused on negotiation, on deal-making, like Tenenbaum described, how does that actually change the game? How does it shift power balances, and what does conflict even look like in the 21st century under that kind of approach?
That's a heavy one. Definitely something to mull over.